The 1970s were a different world. Songs that played on every radio, in every school gym, at every house party. Some of them would never survive today's laws, platforms, or courtrooms. Here are 15 songs every kid played in 1970s that would be illegal today. Number 15, My Generation by The Who, 1965/heavy radio play through the 1970s. My Generation was originally released in 1965, but became a defining anthem played constantly through the 1970s on rock radio stations and at school events across the country. It was the song that summarized a generation's defiance, and teenagers throughout the decade treated it as their personal property. The illegal dimension is pharmaceutical. The song's stuttering vocal delivery, Pete Townshend has acknowledged, was written to mimic the speech patterns of someone under the influence of amphetamines, would run directly into Federal Communications Commission broadcast standards that have tightened significantly since the 1970s. The FCC's current regulations on content that glorifies or depicts drug use, combined with the streaming platform content policies adopted by Spotify, Apple Music, and YouTube in the 2010s, would flag the song for review at minimum. Why don't you all fade away? More practically, the live performances of My Generation during the 1970s routinely ended with the band destroying equipment on stage. The 1967 appearance on the Smothers Brothers Comedy Hour, where Keith Moon packed his bass drum with explosives that detonated far beyond the planned effect, caused actual hearing damage to Pete Townshend and left Moon temporarily dazed and bleeding. By current health and safety regulations governing live performance venues in both the United States and United Kingdom, the pyrotechnic practices of 1970s rock shows would require permits, trained safety officers, and documented risk assessments that the acts of that era simply did not bother with. What passed as performance art then would be a liability lawsuit and a potential criminal charge today. Number 14, A Day in the Life by the Beatles, 1967/banned and widely played through the 1970s. A Day in the Life was banned by the BBC upon its release in 1967, citing drug references, specifically the lyric interpreted as referencing a drug-induced high. It was nonetheless played on pirate radio stations throughout the late 1960s and became a regular fixture on FM rock stations in the United States through the 1970s. The BBC ban was real and documented. It held through multiple years and prevented the song from receiving airplay on the national broadcaster that most British people listened to. American radio ignored the ban entirely, and the song became one of the most played album tracks of the decade on album-oriented rock stations. I read the news today, oh boy. Under today's regulatory environment and platform content policies, the BBC's original reasoning would align closely with the drug reference guidelines that streaming platforms and broadcast regulators now enforce globally. The song would likely require an explicit content label under current Spotify and Apple Music policies, which automatically restricts it from appearing in certain playlist categories and removes it from advertising-supported tiers for younger users. The ease with which American radio in the 1970s simply ignored a regulatory ruling from another country and faced no consequences would not be replicated today, when a single platform content flag can remove a song from the algorithmic recommendation system that drives the majority of music discovery. Number 13, Cocaine by Eric Clapton, 1977. Eric Clapton released Cocaine in 1977 as part of his album Slow Hand, and it became a significant rock radio hit. The song was written by J.J. Cale, and Clapton's version placed it squarely in the mainstream of late 1970s rock. Radio stations played it regularly. It appeared on playlists at parties and in cars, and the subject of its title was stated plainly and repeatedly. Under the Drug-Free Media Act and FCC broadcast guidelines that were strengthened significantly through the 1980s and into the 1990s, the song would face broadcast challenges that it simply did not encounter in 1977. The FCC has historically used its indecency and drug glorification provisions to pressure stations to pull content. And a song whose title is a controlled substance and whose content treats that substance as a functional part of daily life would generate complaints and potential regulatory action under today's enforcement environment. On streaming platforms, Cocaine by Clapton currently exists and is available, but its inclusion in algorithmically generated playlists for certain demographics, including any playlist targeted at younger users, is restricted. In 1977, the average American teenager could hear it on commercial radio with no filter, no warning label, and no parental notification. That specific experience of unrestricted broadcast access is, by today's standards, something that would not be legally replicated. Number 12, Ding Dong, The Witch is Dead, The Wizard of Oz soundtrack charted 1939/viral and recharted 2013. This entry requires explanation. Ding Dong, The Witch is Dead, from the 1939 Wizard of Oz soundtrack, entered the UK singles chart at number 2 in April 2013, following the death of former Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher as a coordinated campaign by people who had opposed her policies. The BBC faced an extraordinary dilemma. Their chart show was legally obligated to play the week's top charting songs, but playing the song in that specific context amounted to broadcasting political commentary on a just-deceased public figure, which violated their editorial guidelines. The BBC's solution was to play a brief news clip explaining the campaign and then play a small excerpt of the song, a compromise that satisfied essentially nobody. What made it genuinely illegal in the broadcasting sense was that a coordinated effort to use the chart system as a vehicle for political messaging had exposed a gap in broadcast law that the regulatory framework had not anticipated. Ofcom, the UK broadcast regulator, faced formal complaints about the BBC's handling of it from multiple directions simultaneously. What this illustrates for 1970s, children is the music of their early years, casual, unrestricted, played at school concerts and on Saturday morning television, existed in a broadcast environment with almost no capacity to restrict or contextualize content beyond the BBC's own internal standards. The legal infrastructure that would have stopped that 2013 situation before it started simply did not exist in the decade when most people watching this video were growing up. Number 11, Physical by Olivia Newton-John, 1981, recalled as a 1970s era act. Physical was released in October 1981, technically outside the 1970s, but Olivia Newton-John was one of the defining musical figures of the late 1970s. Her Grease soundtrack work in 1978 and Totally Hot album in 1978 made her one of the most played artists of that decade, and Physical was the direct commercial and cultural continuation of that run. The song was banned by radio stations in Utah, Australia, and several American markets immediately upon release, with stations citing its explicitly sexual content. It nonetheless reached number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100 and stayed there for 10 consecutive weeks, the longest run at number 1 since 1956. Those bans had no meaningful effect on its commercial success. Under current FCC broadcast standards, the song's content would make it a safe harbor issue, restricted from airing during hours when children might be listening, typically anything before 10 p.m. Under the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act and the platform safety standards adopted by major streaming services in the late 2000s, it would carry an explicit content label and be excluded from family-friendly playlist categories. The fact that it was played on afternoon radio without restriction throughout 1981 and 1982, when many of the children of the 1970s were still in school, represents a standard of broadcast access that current law specifically prohibits. Number 10, School's Out by Alice Cooper, 1972. School's Out was released in June 1972 and became an immediate classic, timed perfectly to the end of the school year and played on radio stations every summer for the following decade. Children loved it. Teachers tolerated it. It was the unofficial anthem of summer vacation throughout the 1970s. The song's content, celebrating the destruction of schools, referencing blowing up the school building, is the issue. Under current zero-tolerance policies adopted by school districts across the United States following school violence in the 1980s and 1990s, any song that references detonating school buildings would be prohibited from school-sanctioned events, school radio stations, and school-managed playlists. Several school districts did attempt to ban the song from school events in the 2000s, following incidents in which its lyrical content was deemed inappropriate in light of actual school violence. Alice Cooper has addressed this in interviews with a mix of amusement and genuine reflection. The song was never intended as anything other than a celebration of summer freedom. The violent imagery was purely metaphorical and understood as such by everyone who heard it in 1972. The legal and institutional context in which that metaphor now exists is entirely different, and the song that every child in America was singing in June 1972 would today be removed from any school-affiliated playlist before it could be played. Number 9, My Sharona by The Knack, 1979. My Sharona has already appeared in a previous video on this channel in the context of its disturbing history. Here, the legal dimension is more specific. The song was written about Sharona Alperin, who was 17 years old at the time Doug Fieger, then 25, wrote it. The song describes, in explicit physical terms, a grown man's obsession with a teenage girl. Under the current statutory framework governing the creation and distribution of content that sexualizes minors, specifically 18 U.S.C. Section 2256, which governs the definition of sexually explicit content involving individuals under 18, the song's lyrical content, applied to a real, named, identifiable minor, would face serious legal scrutiny. The song names its subject, and Alperin's identity was publicly known and confirmed. A song written today by a 25-year-old describing a 17-year-old in these terms, with the subject's identity publicly confirmed, would attract the attention of law enforcement and certainly of prosecutors in jurisdictions with aggressive enforcement of laws governing sexual content involving minors. The song reached number 1 in 1979 and was played on every radio station in America without a single broadcaster questioning its content relative to the age of the person it described. That specific combination, the subject's age, the explicitness of the description, and the confirmed real-world identity, represents a legal exposure that did not exist in 1979 and is very real today. Number 8. Obla-Di, Obla-Da by the Beatles, 1968 / played constantly in the 1970s. The illegal dimension here is copyright and performance rights, not content. Obla-Di, Obla-Da uses a ska-influenced rhythm whose similarity to a bass line composed by Jimmy Scott, a Nigerian conga player who performed with the Beatles informally during the White Album sessions in 1968, was acknowledged in a later legal context. Scott claimed he had contributed the rhythm and melodic bass line to the song and received no credit or compensation. Under the Copyright Act of 1976, which ironically came into effect the same year, the protections for contributed musical elements, including rhythmic and melodic contributions, were significantly expanded compared to the 1909 Act they replaced. The 1976 Act's provisions on joint authorship substantially strengthened the legal position of someone like Scott. Under the legal standards that court decisions of the 1990s and 2000s applied, the kind of analysis seen in the Marvin Gaye Estates lawsuit against Robin Thicke and Pharrell Williams in 2015, a rhythmic contribution as foundational as Scott claimed to have made would have a realistic path to legal recognition. The song was played relentlessly on radio and television throughout the 1970s and appeared in school music programs and children's television. None of that came with any payment to Jimmy Scott. By the standards of copyright law, as it has been interpreted and enforced in the past 30 years, that is a different legal situation than the one that existed when the song was first being played. Number 7. Fernando by ABBA, 1975.
Can you hear the drums, Fernando?
Fernando was released in 1975 and became one of the most commercially successful singles of the decade. It reached number 1 in 13 countries, and in Australia spent 14 weeks at the top of the charts, a record at the time. Children throughout the 1970s knew it by heart. The illegal issue is sampling and interpolation law applied retroactively to its musical elements. The song's opening guitar figure and harmonic structure bear close resemblance to elements of a 1971 composition by Chilean folk musician Quilapayún, whose political music was circulating widely in South America during the years ABBA was developing their sound. The resemblance was noted by musicologists, but never pursued legally during the 1970s, partly because Quilapayún were operating under the political suppression of the Pinochet regime and had limited capacity to pursue international copyright claims.
There was something in the air that night.
Under the Berne Convention protections, as they have been enforced in the post-1990 era, and under the TRIPS Agreement of 1994, which brought intellectual property standards into the framework of international trade law, the musical similarities between Fernando and the earlier composition would today receive a serious legal examination. The standard applied by courts in the years since the Blurred Lines verdict of 2015, in which a jury found for the Gaye estate based on feel and groove similarities rather than exact note-for-note copying, would give the comparison genuine legal weight. ABBA built a commercial empire on material that included these similarities, and Quilapayún received nothing. Number 6. Whole Lotta Love by Led Zeppelin, 1969/rock staple throughout the 1970s. Whole Lotta Love was released in November 1969 and became one of the most played tracks on album-oriented rock stations throughout the 1970s. Its opening riff was one of the most recognizable sounds on radio, and the song's structure, including its extended psychedelic midsection, made it a staple of the era. The illegal dimension is well-documented copyright infringement. The song's primary riff and lyrical content were drawn substantially from You Need Love, recorded by Muddy Waters in 1962, which was itself derived from Bring It On Home, written by Willie Dixon. Dixon sued Led Zeppelin and reached a settlement in 1985. The Dixon estate reached a further settlement with the band in 1987. Robert Plant and Jimmy Page were eventually given co-writing credits on the song. Under the Copyright Act of 1976 and the subsequent strengthening of music copyright enforcement through the 1990s and 2000s, the degree of copying involved would not have resulted in a quiet settlement decades after the fact. It would have resulted in an injunction preventing distribution of the record while litigation proceeded, followed by damages calculated on the basis of the song's enormous commercial success. The song has earned tens of millions of dollars in royalties, synchronization fees, and licensing income since 1969. Willie Dixon received almost none of that. By today's enforcement standards, the song as released in 1969 would not have been commercially distributable without a credit and royalty agreement in place before it shipped. Number 5, With a Little Help from My Friends by Joe Cocker, 1968/1970s television theme. Joe Cocker's version of With a Little Help from My Friends became the theme song of the American television series The Wonder Years when it premiered in 1988. But the recording itself was from 1968 and was one of the most played tracks of the early 1970s in both the United States and United Kingdom. The copyright issue is specific and significant. When The Wonder Years used Cocker's recording as its theme, the show's producers paid synchronization and master use licenses, the standard legal requirements for using a recording in a television production. When the show entered syndication, and later when it was prepared for streaming release, the licensing costs escalated significantly. The show was held off streaming platforms for years, specifically because the cost of clearing all the music rights. Not just Cocker's track, but the extensive catalog of 1960s and 1970s songs used throughout the series had become prohibitively expensive under current licensing law. The Copyright Term Extension Act of 1998 extended the copyright on sound recordings by 20 years, which meant that masters that would have entered the public domain in the late 1990s and early 2000s remained under controlled ownership. The music that children grew up hearing freely on television and radio in the 1970s became, through the evolution of copyright law, a set of assets so legally encumbered that their use in new productions became financially impossible for anything below a major studio budget. Number 4, Stir It Up by Bob Marley and the Wailers, 1973. Stir It Up was released on the Catch a Fire album in 1973 and became one of the most recognized reggae tracks of the decade. Played on rock and pop stations as reggae's crossover into mainstream American and British music accelerated through the mid-1970s. It was the song that introduced millions of young listeners to Bob Marley's catalog. The lyrical and thematic content of Stir It Up is built around cannabis references. The stirring metaphor throughout the song is widely understood to reference marijuana use, and Marley never obscured his relationship with the substance in interviews or performances. Under current FCC broadcast regulations and streaming platform content guidelines, The song's cannabis associations would place it in the same restricted category as explicit drug reference content. More specifically, in the United States, the tension between federal law, under which cannabis remains a Schedule I controlled substance, and the state laws that have legalized it in a growing number of jurisdictions creates a specific legal gray area for broadcast content. The FCC is a federal regulatory body and applies federal standards. A song that unambiguously celebrates cannabis consumption remains subject to FCC indecency considerations on federally regulated broadcast channels, regardless of the state law where the station operates. In 1973, none of this complexity existed. The song played on radio, children heard it, and nobody filed a regulatory complaint. Number 3, Run to the Hills by Iron Maiden, 1982 / treated as a 1970s era track by older Gen X. Run to the Hills was released in February 1982, making it technically outside the 1970s. But Iron Maiden had formed in 1975 and were culturally understood as part of the heavy metal movement that grew directly out of the hard rock of the early 1970s. Their audience was built entirely from the children who had grown up on Black Sabbath and Deep Purple a decade earlier. The song depicts the violent colonial conquest of Native Americans from two perspectives: the indigenous experience in the first verse, the cavalry's perspective in the second, with graphic descriptions of violence and rape that are historically rooted but explicit. Under current broadcast standards and the content review policies that platforms implemented through the 2000s and 10s, the song's depiction of sexual violence and racial violence would place it in the restricted content category for any platform or broadcaster with audience protection guidelines. Several radio stations in Canada and Australia flagged the song during the 2000s in reviews of historical content under updated broadcast standards. The Canadian Broadcast Standards Council has been particularly active in reviewing older recordings against contemporary standards. The song continues to be available on streaming platforms, but carries content advisories on certain services. In the early 1980s, it was played on rock radio to an audience of teenagers who had grown up entirely on 1970s hard rock, with no content warnings of any kind. Number 2, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds by the Beatles, 1967 / decade-long airplay. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was banned by the BBC upon its release in 1967, with the broadcaster publicly stating the song contained a drug reference encoded in its title's initials. John Lennon consistently denied this, saying the title came from a drawing his son Julian had made at school of a classmate named Lucy. That explanation has been accepted by most people who have looked at the historical record, though it has never fully displaced the drug association in popular culture. The ban was real and lasted for years. The song was played freely on American radio and became one of the most recognized tracks in the Beatles' catalog throughout the 1970s, a decade when its original release was 7 or 8 years in the past, and the drug culture it was associated with had become mainstream enough that the controversy had softened considerably. Under current broadcast standards and content platform policies, a song whose title had been publicly and officially identified by a major national broadcaster as a drug reference code, regardless of the creator's intent, would carry that identification as part of its content metadata in the regulatory system. Intent is difficult to enforce and hard to verify. The association, once made and officially recorded, follows the content through every subsequent regulatory review. The BBC's original ban in the modern digital content governance framework would be a flag that persists in the system rather than a decision that can simply be disregarded by a different broadcaster in a different country. Number 1, My Sweet Lord by George Harrison, 1970. My Sweet Lord was one of the most popular songs of the early 1970s, reaching number 1 in the United Kingdom and the United States, and spending weeks at the top of charts around the world. It was George Harrison's declaration of spiritual devotion and became a beloved piece of the decade's musical landscape. Millions of children grew up hearing it on the radio throughout the early part of the decade. Then Bright-Tunes Music Corporation sued George Harrison for copyright infringement, claiming the song's melody was substantially similar to He's So Fine, a 1963 number 1 hit by the Chiffons. The case, Bright-Tunes Music Corporation versus Harrison's Music Limited, went to court and was decided against Harrison in 1976. Judge Richard Owen found that Harrison had engaged in what he termed subconscious plagiarism, that he had not deliberately copied the melody, but had absorbed it so deeply that he reproduced it without awareness. The legal concept of subconscious plagiarism, established in this case, became the foundation for subsequent copyright rulings in music that have expanded enormously in scope and financial consequence since 1976. Harrison eventually purchased Bright-Tunes himself in a complicated subsequent legal proceeding involving his former manager, Alan Klein. The total financial exposure from the case ran into millions of dollars. Under the copyright enforcement standards of the post-2015 era, the period following the blurred lines ruling in which feel, groove, and general similarity became actionable grounds, My Sweet Lord would not have been commercially released without prior clearance. The subconscious plagiarism standard Harrison helped establish would have been applied to his own song before it shipped, rather than after it had already become a global number 1. Every child who sang along with it on the radio in 1971 was humming a melody that was, by the ruling of an American court, legally someone else's. The 1970s operated on a set of assumptions about music, broadcast, copyright, and content that the following decades dismantled one law at a time. The songs that soundtrack that era would face a very different world today. If this gave you something to think about, hit the like button and subscribe. There is always more to dig into.